Dear students, welcome to ePathshala. In this module, we will discuss about nature of problems in developing countries. Briefly, we will learn and discuss about problems in developing countries and how to address those problems. Problems are omnipresent in developing countries due to many reasons, be it policy problems, political issues, social issues, economic issues, and geographical issues. Some developing countries face geographical issues like natural calamities. In natural calamities, some countries frequently face cyclones, earthquakes, famines, landslides, and tsunamis. Poverty and illiteracy are the basic problems in developing countries, which hinder entire development process of those countries. Industrialization is very slow in those countries and they depends on agriculture as primary sector. In developing countries, agriculture is based on rainfed and poor irrigation facilities. Moreover, modern technology in agriculture is less used in those countries. It will reflect on product yielding and the people will face lot of labor problems. In majority of the countries are experiencing climate change which fosters imbalance in the monsoon and some developing countries are facing famines. Health problems in those countries are unmanageable due to their weak policies and poor health infrastructure facilities. The governments spend meager funds on the health. Due to this, the health burden is on the people and they have to expend lot of own funds. The social effects of developing countries lead to many challenges that include individualism of famines, fragmentation of family, social relations, and rapid urbanization that has resulted into rural exodus and displacement of large segments of the population. In terms of per capita income and living standards, not only the gap between the developed and underdeveloped countries is large, but the gap is widening over the years. For example, in 2006, India's per capita income in US dollars was a modest $820 compared to $44,970 of the US, $66,530 of Norway, and $57,230 of Switzerland, Norway. The average GNP per capita of low income countries in 2006 stood at $650 compared to $37,529 for high income countries. Problems in developing countries are like this. First and foremost is poverty. Poverty is very common phenomena in developing countries. Most of the people they are unable to get the monetary benefits and some services provided by the government. According to most recent estimates of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the number of hungry people worldwide is 963 million or about 14.6% of the estimated world population of 6.6 billion, representing an increase of 142 million over the figure for 1990 to 1992. Most of the undernourished are in developing countries. insofar as the poverty line is supposed to be determined principally in terms of the money income needed to avoid going hungry. The large discrepancy between the numbers for poverty and hunger, and especially between their apparent trends, becomes a source of rather fundamental concerns about the significance of the measures being used and cited. Extreme poverty does not entail just having unsatisfied material needs or being undernourished. It is often accompanied by a degrading state of powerlessness. Even in democratic and relatively well governed countries, poor people have to accept daily humiliation without protest. Here, their human rights are violated. Often, they cannot provide for their children and have a strong sense of shame and failure. When they are trapped in poverty, the poor lose hope of ever escaping from their hard work, for which they often have nothing to show beyond bare survival. One more important point is illiteracy. Illiteracy is one of the major factors in developing countries. It will result in the lifestyle of the people and it will hinder the development process. Illiteracy not only limits the full development of individuals and their participation in society, but also has repercussions throughout life, affecting people's family environment, restricting access to the benefits of development, and hindering the enjoyment of other human rights. The close relationship between literacy and national economic development was first noted at the World Congress of Ministers of Education held in Tehran in 1965. Functional literacy was defined as a learned ability which allows individuals to function in a variety of roles: citizens, parents, workers, members of a community, thereby improving productivity. Around the world, the impact of illiteracy on personal income varies, but it is clear earning potential is limited. Literate people earn 30% to 42% less than their literate counterparts and do not have the literacy skills required to undertake further vocational education or training to improve their earning capacity. In the field of population studies, it has long been recognized that education is strongly related to a broad range of demographic behaviors. The spread of education throughout a population has been shown to be of central importance for the long-term demographic transition from high to low levels of fertility. According to Caldwell, in particular, has maintained that high levels of fertility would now here persist for long once a society had achieved mass education. That is to say, once a large majority of children were sent to school. Mingat and Tan concluded that rates of return varied not only by level of schooling but also by level of development. For low income countries, primary education was the best investment, while in middle income countries where primary education already tends to be more widely available, increased investment in secondary education yielded the highest social returns. Among high income countries, returns were greatest for tertiary education. This suggests that in low income settings, primary education deserves priority in the allocation of resources. The World Bank has argued that based on such evidence, many countries have misallocated spending between education subsectors, with a disproportionate share of resources going to secondary and university education. One more important point in developing countries we need to explore, that climate change. If you look at developing countries, each and every developing country has facing climate change problem, be it cyclone, famine and earthquakes and other climatical changes occurs, and it affects the food chain. Impacts of climate change will have a disproportional negative impact on developing countries. Climate change will compound existing poverty. Its adverse impacts will be more striking in the developing nations because of their geographical and climatic conditions, their high dependence on natural resources, and their limited capacity to adapt to a changing climate. Within these countries, the poorest, who have the least resources and the least capacity to adapt, are the most vulnerable. Projected changes in the incidence, frequency, intensity and duration of climate extremes, for example heat waves, heavy precipitation and drought, as well as more gradual changes in the average climate, will notably threaten their livelihoods, further increasing inequalities between the developing and developed world. Climate change is therefore a serious threat to poverty eradication. However, current development strategies tend to overlook climate change risks. Poorer nations are disproportionately vulnerable to disasters and hence to the effects of climate change for a number of reasons. Firstly, the ability to adapt and cope with weather hazards depends on economic resources, infrastructure, technology and social safety nets. Developing countries often do not have the resources for these and thus are ill prepared in terms of coastal protection, early warning and disaster response system, and victim relief and recovery assistance. Secondly, for many countries, climate change is only one of the many environment problems they confront. Many are already under pressure from population growth, rapid urbanization and resource depletion, making them vulnerable to the further challenges thrown up by the climate change. The climate change will change the society system and it will affect the employment of poorer. The poorer cannot cope with the climate change. Sometimes they have to leave their jobs due to climate change. The climate change directly affects the occupations of the poor in the developing countries. One more important point is health. In developing countries, millions of people suffer from avoidable health problems such as infectious diseases, malnutrition and complications of childbirth simply because they are poor. Wide differences in health status between poorer and better off people are often avoidable and unfair, reflecting different socio-economic constraints and opportunities rather than different individual choices. And while governments have made strides in improving public health over the last several decades, many initiatives to improve the health of the poorest people have been unsuccessful. If you look at this graph, health inequalities in less developed countries from 1990 to 2002, under 5 mortality rate 2.2% was occurred in 52 countries, women malnourished in 45 countries it is 1.9%, child stunted in 50 countries the percent is 3.2. One of the most extensive studies to date on health inequalities in less developed countries uses data from demographic and health surveys conducted in 56 countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America. The surveys cover a range of population and health issues and measure socio-economic status by inquiring about household assets and services. Researchers constructed a household wealth index from this data and divided the population in each country into 5 groups of equal size or quantiles based on individuals' relative standing on the household wealth index within the country. The DHS analysis shows that the poorest quantiles fare worse than the wealthiest quantiles on a range of health outcomes, including childhood mortality and nutritional status. One study of childhood nutrition in 20 developing countries found that 18 countries had statistically significant inequalities in stunting and underweight, 2 international measures of malnourishment. Another important point in developing countries is high rate of population growth. The population of the less developed region is projected to rise steadily from about 5.3 billion persons today to 7.8 billion persons by mid-century. That projection assumes continuing declines in fertility. In the absence of such declines, the population of the less developed regions could be substantially larger than projected. Particularly, rapid growth is expected in the group of 50 countries classified as the least developed. By mid-century, for example, the population of the least developed countries could more than double in size. The annual increment to world population during 2000 to 2005 has been estimated at 76 million persons. 6 countries account for nearly half of that amount: India 22%, China 11%, and Pakistan, Nigeria, the United States of America and Bangladesh about 4% each. As a result of India's relatively rapid growth, it is expected to overtake China as the most populous country in the world by 2030. The least developed countries have the highest population growth rate in the world, triple that of other developing countries, and are the least able to meet the needs of growing numbers of population. The overall population of the 48 least developed countries is growing today nearly twice as fast as that of the developing world, at 2.3% annually versus 1.2% per year. Over the next 40 years, the population of the low developing countries will increase by about 100%, whereas the population of the other developing countries will increase by about 30%, and the population of the developed countries will grow by a mere percent, according to the median projection of the United Nations Population Division. Technological backwardness is one of the character of developing countries. Why? Because the governments are unable to spend on technological extension. They cannot fund for the development of technological innovation. This will result in their developing process. Most of the developing countries are still backward in using technology. The local governments are unable to spend on the technology transfers. The spread of technology is one of the central ideas underpinning growth theory in economics. Rich countries are positioned at the technology frontier, meaning that their economies make virtually full use of the best available devices, practices, ideas, and know how to generate their output. For these countries, marginal productivity gains depend on the discovery of new technologies that push the technology frontier further out. In contrast, poorer countries are positioned some distance back from technologies. Poor countries' opportunity to make use of proven technologies without having to develop them from scratch is one factor that allows them to grow faster than rich countries under the right conditions and thereby accelerate closer to the frontier. Economic development is not a smooth process of many developing countries catching up with the industrialized countries. Rather, starting from a situation where a rich and poor group of countries coexist, the models outline mechanisms that make industrialization spread in waves from country to country, causing few countries to make a rapid transition from the poor to the rich club. The technology is one of the biggest problem in developing countries. Why? Because these people, these governments cannot handle the technology or cannot fund to innovate new technologies. The new technology will promote industrialization. The industrialization will promote opportunities. The employment opportunities will help the developing countries to improve their economies. Moreover, the local people will get employment opportunities, thereby their purchasing power will be improved. Hence, the technology will definitely help the developing countries to enhance their economies. One other important point here is high dependence on agriculture and other primary sectors. In developing countries, most of the people will depend on agriculture. It is a primary sector and it will provide jobs. In those primary sector employment opportunities, people will get meager incomes. The agriculture will help to people some extent. Agriculture is underperforming in many developing countries for a number of reasons. Theodore Schultz specified the two different agriculture problems confronted by low income and high income economies. He referred to the food problems as that faced by low income economies. These economies characterized by rapid population growth and high food demand elasticity are under the constant risk of experiencing shortage in the supply of food relative to demand. The resulting high food prices pull up the costs of living and the wage rates of workers in non-farm sectors and thereby suppress industrialization and overall economic growth. Therefore, the prime policy concern in low income economies is to prevent food shortage from occurring. Agriculture is a source of livelihoods for an estimated 86% of rural people. It provides jobs for 1.3 billion smallholders and landless workers. Farm financed social welfare when there are urban shocks and a foundation for viable rural communities. Of the developing world's 5.5 billion people, 3 billion live in rural areas, nearly half of humanity. Of these rural inhabitants, can estimated 2.5 billion are in households involved in agriculture and 1.5 billion are in smallholder households. About 70% of the world's very poor people live in rural areas, and large population of the poor and hungry are children and young people. Problems in agriculture in developing countries are irrigation facilities are very less. Irrigation facilities are still in dilapidated condition. The agriculture is based on rain-fed. Sometimes monsoon will fail, it will result in the crop yielding. And another point, poor technology in agriculture. The farmers are unable to access the technology because they are illiterate. They cannot handle the technology. This will result in the crop yield. And another important point is marketing facilities. In developing countries, marketing facilities are very less. Sometimes the farmers cannot store their food in their house. Besides, they cannot store their food in godowns. The godowns are not available and marketing facilities are very less. In this context, the government should provide minimum support price. Sometimes the farmers should wait for the minimum support price. These are all the problems of developing countries. The developing countries definitely face challenges from climate, local system and structures. It will help to address the local problems. The government should devise some plans to help their citizens. Thank you.